Number 10. The rules that changed everything. In 1961, Formula One changed overnight. The governing body slashed maximum engine capacity from 2.5 liters down to 1.5. British teams fought this change for years, lobbying hard against it. They argued it would ruin the sport. They lost. Teams like Cooper, BRM, and Lotus had spent years perfecting their Coventry Climax 4-cylinder engines at the larger displacement, making this a disaster. They had absolutely nothing ready. Coventry Climax themselves showed little interest in building a new small-capacity racing engine, leaving British constructors with no backup supplier. Their solution was to adapt the existing Climax F PF engine, shrinking it to fit the limit. The Mark II displaced 1499.8 cubic centimeters, producing 152 horsepower at 8,000 revolutions per minute. Adequate, but nothing more. Ferrari, however, saw this coming. While the British teams protested the rule changes, Enzo Ferrari had been quietly developing a 1.5-liter V6 engine in Formula 2 for 2 full years before the regulations took effect. Ferrari ran their smaller engine in real races throughout 1960, learning and refining while their rivals were still writing angry letters. By 1961, Ferrari had a purpose-built engine with thousands of racing miles on it. The British had a compromise. That gap in preparation would define the entire season. Number 9. The Ferrari 156 Sharknose. The car built around that engine was the 156, and it earned its nickname the second people saw it. 2 angled air intakes on the nose gave it a menacing, predatory look that no rival car could match. The name stuck instantly: Sharknose. Carlo Chiti, Ferrari's chief designer, set the V6 at a 120-degree angle between cylinder banks. This was no cosmetic choice. A conventional 60 or 90-degree V6 sits much taller in the chassis. By spreading the cylinders wider, Chiti lowered the engine's center of gravity, improving cornering balance. Every 120 degrees of crankshaft rotation produced a power pulse, giving the engine incredibly smooth delivery. It produced around 190 horsepower at 9,500 revolutions per minute. And it was lighter than the 4-cylinder Climax the British teams ran. Ferrari had built an engine that made more power, weighed less, and sat lower in the chassis than anything the competition had. Ferrari entered 3 Sharknoses at Monaco. Phil Hill, the quiet American who would go on to win the title that year, and Wolfgang von Trips, the German aristocrat who was the other title favorite, tragically killed at Monza later that season, and Richie Ginther, the young Californian who just joined the team, getting the newest version of the car with the latest 120-degree engine, while his teammates ran 65-degree units. 3 works cars, 3 elite drivers, full backing from Maranello. Against them, a single privateer in a year-old car. Number 8, the Lotus 18. Colin Chapman designed the Lotus 18 in 1959, and for its time, it was a revelation. The space frame chassis was built from heavily triangulated steel tubes, with the entire car weighing under 1,000 pounds in original 2.5-liter form. Its panels were lightweight aluminum bolted directly to the frame rather than being structurally integrated. Chapman's entire philosophy was built on one principle: add lightness. Where other designers added material for strength, Chapman stripped it away for speed. The fuel tank sat directly above the driver's knees, and the suspension featured double wishbones at the front with inboard coilover units, keeping unsprung weight to a minimum. Everything was pared down to the essentials. The car already gave Lotus its first Formula One victory when Stirling Moss won the 1960 Monaco Grand Prix in Rob Walker's entry. It was highly competitive at the larger engine capacity, but by 1961, the car was a year old. Lotus had already built its successor, the sleeker Lotus 21, which Jim Clark would drive at Monaco as a works entry. The Lotus 18 Moss raced was a customer car modified for the smaller 1.5-liter engine, but running on a chassis built for a bigger, more powerful unit. It used a Kaladi gearbox instead of the Lotus sequential unit, Girling disc brakes, and Dunlop tires, making 152 horsepower. The Ferraris had 190. That gap, roughly 25% more power for Ferrari, was impossible to overcome on long straights. But Monaco, with its tight corners and short bursts of acceleration, was the one place on the calendar where the Lotus stood a chance. Moss knew it. Everyone did. Number 7, the man who turned down Ferrari. Stirling Moss was already the most famous racing driver in Britain by 1961. He had won 16 championship Grand Prix races across 5 different constructors, a record of versatility that no other driver could match. He finished second in the World Championship 4 consecutive years from 1955 to 1958, racing against Juan Manuel Fangio in 3 of those seasons. In 1958, he lost the title to Mike Hawthorne by a single point, and the reason he lost tells you everything about who Moss was as a person. At the Portuguese Grand Prix that year, Hawthorne faced disqualification for pushing his car against the direction of the track after a spin. The stewards wanted to strip his second-place finish, but Moss, who won the race, walked into the stewards' room and testified that Hawthorne pushed his car on the pavement, not the racing surface, and didn't interfere with any other competitor. The stewards reversed their decision, letting Hawthorne keep his 6 points. At the end of the season, Hawthorne won the championship by a single point over Moss, the point that Moss's own honesty had preserved. By 1961, he was widely considered the greatest driver in the world. Ferrari wanted him, and so did several factory teams. Moss chose to stick with Rob Walker's private team, baffling the paddock. But it made perfect sense to Moss. He valued loyalty and independence over factory team politics. Number 6, Rob Walker and the Gentleman Racer. Rob Walker was the heir to the Johnny Walker whiskey fortune, using his wealth to run the most successful private team in Formula One history. Walker's cars were painted dark blue with a white nose stripe. Between 1958 and 1961, Moss won 7 championship races in Walker's cars. No other privateer has ever come close. Walker ran things from a Pip Brook garage near Dorking. No factory, no wind tunnel, and definitely no team of engineers running simulations. Just chief mechanic Al Francis, a tiny crew, and a driver who extracted performance the car had no right to deliver. Built on deep trust and mutual respect, their partnership produced results that embarrassed the wealthiest teams on the grid. For Monaco in 1961, the Lotus 18 was it. No backup plan, no second driver, just one car, one driver, and the cold truth that the Ferraris would outrun them on every single straight. Number 5, the cracked chassis. On race morning, Monaco was heating up. It would be a scorching day on the Côte d'Azur, and the race would last nearly 3 hours. The mechanics had already decided to strip the side panels off the Lotus to help cool the cockpit. A move that left Moss exposed from the waist down with absolutely nothing between him and the Monaco barriers but open air. Then Al Francis spotted the crack. It was right there in one of the chassis tubes. The light, rigid space frame designed by Chapman had fractured, and the brake sat right next to a fuel tank filled with petrol. A structural failure in this kind of chassis is a major disaster. The whole car relied on that network of tubes for its strength. A crack meant a severely compromised structure, and at Monaco, that meant the car could easily wrap itself around a barrier at any point during 100 brutal laps. Under any normal circumstances, you would instantly withdraw the car. You definitely wouldn't try to weld steel just inches from a highly flammable fuel tank minutes before a Grand Prix. Francis threw wet rags over the fuel tank, fired up his torch, and welded the crack shut right on the starting grid. The race officials had absolutely no idea. Neither did the rival teams. Moss sat waiting, knowing his chassis had just been welded together by a guy crouching with a blowtorch right next to a full gas tank. If you want one image that defines privateer racing in 1961, that is absolutely it. Number 4, qualifying. Practice had been a mess, Moss's engine was running rough, and the carburetor was acting up. The night before final qualifying, Francis tracked down the Weber rep and demanded he deliver a brand new unit straight to their garage. They tore both units apart, completely discovering a tiny manufacturing defect inside the float chamber's groove. The problem was fixed overnight. On Saturday afternoon, with the engine running right, Moss delivered a lap that defied explanation. 1 minute 39.1 seconds around Monte Carlo in an older car with 152 horsepower. Pole position. Richie Ginther, driving the most powerful Ferrari on the grid, was 0.2 of a second slower. Jim Clark sat third in the new factory Lotus 21. Phil Hill and Wolfgang von Trips lined up behind them in Ferraris. Moss dragged the slowest car among the frontrunners to pole through pure grit. Now could he hold that insane pace for 100 laps? Over 80% of you watching aren't subscribed yet. If you're liking this story, please take a second and hit subscribe. It helps the channel immensely. Now back to the track. Number 3, the first 50 laps. Louis Caron dropped the starting flag, and Ginther used Ferrari's raw horsepower to rocket into the lead. Clark held second briefly before a fuel pump failure forced him to pit early, completely taking him out of the running. Moss inherited second, but Ginther was pulling away fast. By the end of lap 3, the Ferrari was 5 seconds clear. Moss later admitted it took a few laps to find his groove, and Ginther's early pace finally shocked him into action. Joe Bonnier's Porsche glued itself to Moss's tail, and the two of them began reeling in the lead Ferrari together. On lap 14, Moss slipped past Ginther at the gasworks hairpin, where the Lotus's nimble handling canceled out the Ferrari's straight line speed. Bonnier followed him through, dropping Ginther to third as the Ferraris regrouped. Phil Hill found his way past Bonnier, with Ginther following, while Von Trips slipped past the Porsche too. By lap 25, the running order settled Moss leading, followed by Hill Ginther and Von Trips. Three Ferraris in formation behind a single Lotus, but Moss had built a 10-second cushion in an underpowered car on a track lined with concrete. 10 seconds. The Ferraris pushed as hard as possible, but still fell behind. Number 2, the final 25 laps. At half distance, Moss led by 8 seconds, but by lap 60, the gap shrank to 3. The Ferraris were closing in. Phil Hill chased relentlessly, but couldn't get by later, describing the sheer frustration as completely indescribable, pushing his car to the limit and still failing to catch Moss. Meanwhile, Ginther shadowed his teammate for 30 laps, likely held back by team orders. But on lap 75, Ferrari boss Romolo Tavoni ordered Hill to yield. Ginther saw a pit board held out with just a single word faster. He later admitted it actually made him laugh. What else did they think he was giving them? With Hill out of the way, Ginther launched his final attack. The gap began to shrink 4 seconds, then 3. With 10 laps left, Ginther trailed the Lotus by under 3 seconds. Every lap, Ginther pushed harder. Every lap, Moss matched his pace. Both drivers were now lapping 3 seconds faster than their qualifying times. It was a performance over 100 laps that Motorsport magazine writer Dennis Jenkinson called hard to believe. Moss averaged 1 minute 39.5 seconds per lap. His pole position time had been just 1 minute, 39.1 seconds. He kept up that qualifying pace for almost 3 hours in blistering heat, driving a car with no side panels on a chassis welded together just that morning. Riding into that final lap, Moss kept gluing his eyes to the mirrors. He later admitted he spent the whole race convinced the Ferraris were just biding their time, swapping places behind him for fun and waiting to blast past. He had no clue their pits were giving frantic signals because they simply could not catch him. First place, 3.6 seconds. Moss crossed the line 3.6 seconds ahead of Ginther. Hill was third, Von Tripp's fourth. 3 factory Ferraris all running, all driven flat out, and all beaten by one man in an outdated car. Ginther climbed out of his cockpit and called it the best race of his life. Hearing that Moss considered it his finest too made Ginther feel incredibly proud. Phil Hill was less polite. He admitted he would gladly trade some of Ferrari's raw horsepower for the brilliant handling of that Lotus. Moss's Monaco win in 1961 bought British teams exactly 1 race. Ferrari still took 5 of the remaining 7 rounds that season. Phil Hill claimed the title, though the victory was darkened by Von Tripp's dying at Monza when his Ferrari plowed into the crowd, killing 15 spectators along with him. Moss would end up third in the championship standings for the 3rd straight year. He won once more that season at a rainy Nürburgring in treacherous wet conditions again in the Lotus 18, again beating the Ferraris. The rain leveled the playing field, giving Moss another chance to show what he could do with an underpowered car on a track rewarding. Sheer guts and precision above everything else. Those 2 legendary victories, Monaco and the Nürburgring, were the only races all year that Ferrari lost. The next April at Goodwood, Moss crashed his Lotus during the Glover Trophy, suffering severe head trauma. What caused the crash remained a mystery. He was 32 years old. After a year of recovery, he went back to test at an empty Goodwood, and his times looked decent. But something had changed. The lightning reflexes he relied on were just a fraction slower now. He walked away from professional racing. He won 212 of the 529 races he entered across all forms of motorsport: Formula One sports cars, touring cars, and rallying. He won Grand Prix races for 5 different teams. That kind of versatility points to pure talent over machine. He never won the world championship. Years later, he was asked if that still bothered him. Moss said he would rather be remembered as the driver who should have won than just another name on a championship list. He noted that some pretty average drivers have won it once. He wanted his legacy built on what he did behind the wheel, not the points table. For decades, British cops pulling over speeders had a standard line: "Who do you think you are?" Stirling Moss. His name became synonymous with speed in the British vocabulary. And Monaco 1961 is why. 1 car, 1 driver, 100 laps, 3.6 seconds. The greatest drive Formula One has ever seen. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. We will see you in the next one.